Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Elephant Back Loop Trail in Yellowstone National Park. The park is seated on the side of the world's largest batholith volcano, which provides the energy for the geysers and geothermal phenomenon here. This area is around 8,000 feet high in elevation and is thickly timbered rolling hills overlooking Yellowstone Lake. The forests, primarily of lodgepole pine, are 150 to 300 years old and are described by the Yellowstone Board of Review report regarding this episode as gray and brown in color. Given the age of the forest and the amount of duff accumulated on the forest floor, many forms of edible fungi grow on the ground and deadfall trees. These fungi provide a valuable source of nutrients to animals in the area and perform a vital function in the ecosystem. Animals like elk, deer, and moose will often dine on mushrooms whenever they can find them. Of the predators in the area, only bobcats and cougars are not known to consume mushrooms, but wolves, coyotes, as well as black bears and grizzly bears frequently seek them out as fare. Elephant Back Trail climbs 800 feet over its duration, which is only 1.5 miles long. About 0.8 of a mile up the trail is a fork. The left route leads directly to the overlook, which grants visitors a stunning view of the lake. The right route winds a bit more, but ends at the same overlook. As far as trails go, it isn't much of a trail, as it only takes visitors an hour or so to complete the loop. But if danger were measured by distance, it may be one of the most dangerous trails in the world. On Thursday, August 6, 2015, 63-year-old Lance Crosby was performing his duties at Lake Medical Clinic, where he had worked for the past 5 years. He was a native of Billings, Montana, and an avid hiker and outdoorsman. Just before lunchtime, Lance's coworkers reported seeing him at the medical center. He had recently injured his ankle and was in the habit of going out for walks near the center to help it heal and rehabilitate it. Lance enjoyed taking shortcuts through trail circuits just to wander through the stands of trees. On this day, he took no firearm nor bear spray with him. His coworkers watched Lance walk off along the road toward Elephant Back Trail and returned to their duties. On August 7th, Lance was expected at the center for work, but didn't show up at the start of his 8 a.m. shift. The staff thought this was peculiar, as he wasn't the kind of person to be late, and definitely would have called in had he come down with an illness. By 9 a.m., the staff at the medical center called in and reported Lance missing. Park rangers immediately formed a search team, and foot search teams began searching on Yellowstone Lake Beach, Natural Bridge Road, and Elephant Back Trail. During the search on Elephant Back Trail, a ranger discovered a carnivore food cache with a boot protruding ominously from beneath it. The ranger immediately backed out of the area, and all hikers were ordered to leave to preserve safety and evidence. An investigative team comprised of law enforcement officers, biologists, and medical professionals was formed. After the report of the carnivore food cache had reached the team, they prepared for a body recovery. About a half-mile northeast of the trail, rangers heard a cub bark 3 or 4 times as they approached. They observed a sow with dark brown legs and a light brown rump running away from the cache site. Once at the site, the investigative team began gathering evidence. They could see grizzly tracks from one sow and at least one cub near Lance's body. The bears had partially eaten his remains and then covered him in dirt and pine needles, indicating they were planning on returning to eat the rest of him after digesting the portions they had already consumed. Lance's remains were removed by a helicopter and analyzed by forensic experts. They found deep bruising and puncture wounds on his arms, hands, head, face, shoulders, and upper back, indicating that he was alive when these wounds were inflicted. He had attempted to defend himself during the bear attack, based on the location of the wounds on his arms and hands. The puncture wounds on Lance's corpse were measured for comparison with the teeth of any bear thought to have been involved. After further analysis, Lance was found to have died from blunt force trauma to the area near his brainstem. He had been struck by the sow's paws with enough force that the blows had caused his death. At the attack scene, forensic experts collected bear hair samples and bodily fluids from the bears. They discovered that the grizzly had killed Crosby in an ambush and left him with very little time to react. He was face down with his left arm beneath his chest and his left leg crossed over his right calf. I've posted pictures of the attack site sketched by the forensics teams, as well as the picture of the dead bear on my Patreon link below. These images would not pass YouTube guidelines, so you can see them there. They are disturbing, at least as disturbing as a sketch of a bear attack scene and a photo of a dead bear can be, so look at them at your own discretion. Lance's baseball cap was found near his left boot, and his body was buried right where the attack had occurred, meaning the grizzly had not dragged him away at all. The investigators also reported that she had not run upon him, but the attack happened from extremely close range. The soil around the attack site wasn't disturbed. There were no tissue or clothing fragments strewn about, and his possessions were found near his body. He didn't even have time to run. The biologists on the scene searched for natural feeding behaviors and evidence. Bear daybeds and scat were located right next to rock cairns and other human-created rock formations left by prior visitors. DNA evidence was pulled from scat piles, and profiles from a sow and a cub were identified. They determined that the bears were likely foraging for mushrooms, and Lance had walked right up to them just before the attack. They were likely devouring mushrooms or napping just afterward when the surprise confrontation occurred. Equipped with this knowledge, biologists set out foot snare traps at the attack scene, hoping to catch the sow when she returned to her food cache. The night following the attack, she triggered the snare, and it held her fast until bear researchers could tranquilize her. Upon confirming through DNA evidence and bite wound measurements that they had the right bear, officials ordered the sow to be euthanized. As for her cubs, they were also trapped in the following days. They were not killed, but authorities deemed them to possibly be conditioned to see people as food. They were sent to a zoo to live out the remainder of their lives. After euthanizing the sow, investigators determined that she was only 259 pounds, which is thin for a grizzly bear. She had invested much of her food in the 1-year-old cubs she'd been raising. Regarding euthanizing grizzlies, park officials stated that they do not take the matter lightly. Had the sow been determined to have acted in defense of her cubs, she would likely have been left alone, if not relocated to areas further from civilization. Given that she had consumed portions of Lance's body and cached his remains for later consumption, they had no choice in the matter. Lance Crosby's death was the 8th human fatality in Yellowstone since 1916, but the 5th since 1984. 44 people have reportedly been injured by bears in Yellowstone National Park over its 150-year history. Grizzly numbers are estimated to be over 1,000 bears in the greater Yellowstone area, with the park only claiming 150 to 200 grizzlies within its boundaries. That means the difference of up to 800 grizzly bears are spread all around Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. If Lance had been packing bear spray, would he even have had time to dispense it? Was the sow defending her mushroom feeding grounds, or did she predate on Lance? Do you think the cubs would have copied the behavior they saw the sow do and consider humans as a source of food in their future? That's an ominous thought. Grizzly bears in the zoo watching something they think of as food walk by and stare at them and throw peanuts at them all day. Will you cast an extra cautious glance over your shoulder next time you're out picking mushrooms? I'll be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Kenai Peninsula in southern Alaska. This huge jut of land pokes into the Gulf of Alaska and extends toward Kodiak Island. It has some high mountains in the southeast of the peninsula, but near Soldotna is a low-elevation plain that gently rolls into the Cook Inlet. The towns here push into the forest, which consists of birch, hemlock, and spruce trees. Common animals here include moose, porcupines, and hares. The predators on the peninsula are much more diverse, with weasels, foxes, lynx, and coyotes rounding out the smaller meat-eaters. The larger ones are much more dangerous and include wolves, black bears, and brown bears. The Kenai River originates at Kenai Lake, which is fed by the Russian River. It flows for about 50 miles as the crow flies and empties into the Cook Inlet near the town of Kenai. The salmon that migrate upstream begin their lives as fry, which grow in Kenai and Skylac lakes before making their way to the sea for a few years. Upon their return, the salmon continue a flow of nutrients from the land to the sea and back again that sustains brown bears, as well as many other plants and animals in the ecology. This cycle on the Kenai Peninsula has supported over 600 brown bears. But these bears are genetically isolated and are trending downward in numbers, according to recent assessments. They have a unique gene pool among brown bears, which would be a pity to see go extinct. Just a little east of Soldotna is a town called Funny River. It is a dot of a town, which doesn't seem like a town at all, but more of an incorporated area. Around mile marker 11 of the Funny River Road that runs through town, a 62-year-old man named Danny High had his home on an acreage. One of his favorite things to do was to take the dogs for a walk and enjoy the fresh air and beautiful scenery the Kenai River offers. Now, Danny's acreage was at an interesting location on Funny River Road. To the south is land owned by varying federal, state, and tribal agencies, which is left in its natural state. Here, brown bears can travel freely and fight and mate and do all the normal bear stuff. To the west and the east of Danny's property, housing developments and busy roads crowd the bears' access to the Kenai River and the salmon that they pull from it. But right near Danny's property, development thins, and access to the river is much easier for the bears. To find similar access to the river, the bears would have to go 6 miles to the east, just to avoid human development. This bottleneck in travel corridors creates a funnel for hungry bears and leads them on a path right to Danny's and his neighbors' doorsteps. On September 13, 2015, around 4:30 p.m., Danny was out walking the dogs along one of the many four-wheeler roads that crisscross the area. The trails make the perfect escape into the trees that surround the residential developments. Brown bears are a frequent sight on these trails, but locals are so used to being near them that their presence isn't even alarming. On his hike, Danny didn't bring a firearm, nor did he bring along bear spray. Danny was such a good neighbor, he would frequently take his neighbor's dog for a walk. The dog's name was Layla, and her owner was named Diane Deming. After Danny picked up Layla from Diane's house, the two of them disappeared into the labyrinth of quad trails for a quick escape. Diane knew they wouldn't be long, and expected them to return in about 30 minutes or so. Danny enjoyed one of the benefits of pet ownership without the responsibility of taking care of one. He often took Layla out for walks, and she seemed to enjoy them too. After he spent some time relaxing in the woods, the two of them would go back and resume their lives as usual. But today would turn out to be very different from most days. As Danny and Layla made their way into the nearby trees, another denizen was also using the quad trails. A huge brown bear was likely making his way along the Kenai River in search of salmon carcasses or berries to pack on weight for hibernation. It was mid-fall now, and if the bear didn't have enough calories, it might not make it through the winter, so every calorie mattered. At this point of the fall, bears are in a state called hyperphagia, which is a hormonal state of intense hunger and desire for food. They are known to cover much broader swaths of territory in search of food sources, and will sometimes seek food from sources they wouldn't consider in prior seasons of the year. If the berry season was poor, or the salmon run was meager, then bears would have no option but to push in closer to town in search of food. As Danny and Layla walked down the quad trail, at some point they crossed paths with this massive brown bear. The details of just how this run-in occurred have not been relayed or made public. The results of the incident left Danny with grievous injuries and sent Layla dashing back to Diane. At 4:36 p.m., Diane heard Layla scratching at the back door. Before she could let Layla in, she heard her scratching at the front door. Diane hurried back toward the front door and let Layla inside, but Danny wasn't with her. Diane thought that perhaps he'd let her run ahead of him, so she glanced down the road, but couldn't see Danny. After a few minutes, her questions were answered, as emergency vehicles began to blare their sirens and converge on a nearby location. There was no way Diane could know, but a brown bear had attacked Danny while he and Layla were out for a walk. After Danny was severely injured, he somehow managed to pull out his cell phone and call 911. The sirens Diane heard were responding to his own request for help. First responders were sent out to the attack location at 4:45 p.m., and the first unit arrived by 4:58 p.m. Although their description of Danny's injuries was not detailed, they were described as very serious. It took the paramedics only 5 minutes to request a medical helicopter to Danny's location. It ferried him to a hospital in Anchorage, where he was held in critical condition. Danny went through his first surgery there on Monday. With injuries beyond their scope of care, the hospital in Anchorage arranged for an emergency medical flight, which took Danny to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Washington. After arriving at Harborview, additional surgical procedures would be completed to close and repair tissue damage the bear had done to Danny. Wildlife officers quickly converged on the attack site and searched for the bear responsible for Danny's mauling. Even though the search was thorough, it was fruitless in finding a bear in the area. Authorities decided to adopt a strategy of waiting out the bear to see if it would return and pose further risks to residents of the area. After the bear didn't return, they concluded that the attack was likely defensive and the bear didn't have predatory motives in attacking Danny. According to Danny's wife, his recovery was slow but steady. Given his proximity to town and access to immediate medical attention, his life was saved. Events could have ended up very differently for him if he were only a few miles away from the resources needed to save his life. From the time Danny left Diane's house with Layla to the point he called 911, only 6 minutes had elapsed. He was located a quarter-mile from his home, which means most of that 6 minutes was spent walking with Layla and not being attacked by the bear. In only a few seconds, this bear did enough damage to Danny's body to threaten his life in a location that would make the thought of this scenario unlikely. Due to the rapid response and availability of medical attention, he survived. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think bear spray would have prevented this attack? I kinda doubt it. Do you think Layla's presence may have been a contributing factor in the attack? Is the development around Kenai River an example of poor planning? The next time you take your dog out for a walk in the woods, will you be packing bear spray or a firearm? I'll gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to central Romania, to the Carpathian Mountains. The South Carpathians have a range called the Addicus Mountains. They are a spectacular high range with peaks stretching over 8,000 feet in elevation, and are one of Europe's last remaining wilderness areas. The rocky peaks of the mountains give way to forests at about 6,500 feet in elevation. This range hosts about 6,000 European brown bears, which is about 60% of the European brown bear population, and is one of the few places they are still flourishing. In the Addicus, oak and beech trees shelter bison, wild boar, and Danube Delta wild horses. These animals don't roam freely in much of their prior European habitat, so Romania's efforts to preserve them are admirable. The predators of this area include wolves, lynx, and brown bears. On June 9, 2019, 26-year-old German graduate student Andy Bauer was hiking with his 23-year-old partner, Laura Booth, from Cambridge, UK. They had accepted an invitation to enjoy a 5-day expedition through the Addicus Mountains, backpacking their way from one tent campsite to the next. They were attending graduate school in Berlin, Germany, and looking forward to some time in the wilderness. The life of a student can be stressful, so they took the opportunity while they had the time to do it. As they packed their backpacks for the trip, Laura grabbed her bear spray and placed it in her pile of items to pack. Andy told her that they were more likely to have the bear spray explode than to experience a bear attack, so she agreed to take it out and leave it at home. They drove to a mountain town called Briaza and parked their car in front of a monastery. A priest struck up a conversation with the couple and inquired about their plans. Once they informed him, he cautioned them from going into the mountains. Laura had a sense of foreboding about the trip, but chalked these feelings up to them adventuring into the wilderness. She had been reading about panthers and bears, and thought she may have worked herself up with such information. On the first day of the hike, they saw a lizard and a snake. They'd also watched 6 wild boars root around for food on the forest floor. Andy jokingly said they would next see a bear. On the second day of their trip, they had hiked about 3 hours before they came upon a mangled and partially eaten deer fawn. It was fresh, and was a clear sign that a bear was in the area. They hadn't seen any bear tracks or scat, so this sudden sight was concerning. Andy was walking about 20 feet ahead of Laura when they walked upon the fawn. They had paused to look the carcass over when they heard a rustling in the bushes right next to them. Andy lifted his gaze from the fawn carcass, and his legs went weak with what filled his vision. An enormous brown bear was standing less than 4 feet from him, and alongside her were her 2 cubs. The sow's shoulder was nearly the same height as Andy as he stood to his full height. The sow swung her head toward Andy and was unaware of the hikers, until now. Upon seeing him, she let out a roar so loud that it vibrated his rib cage. Andy wanted to run, but was frozen in fear. He was facing slightly away from the bear, with her to his right-hand side. His mind was racing so fast that he could not decide what to do. The sow leaped forward and clamped her jaws around his right calf muscle. With a powerful jerk of her massive head, she dropped him to his back and dragged him several feet. Laura was petrified with fear upon sight of the bears. She could only yell at the bear while it jerked Andy from his feet. As she watched, the bear tossed her head back and forth very quickly, which jerked Andy from one side of the bear to the other and then back again. Then the sow dragged Andy several yards into the bushes. Laura followed them into the brush while making sure to stay away from the cubs. As the pain shot through Andy's right calf muscle, he yelled for Laura to help him. Laura screamed out to Andy to punch the bear in the eye, as she had heard somewhere that this was a way to defend yourself during a bear attack. Andy swung his fist at the bear's eye with all of his might. He knew there was nothing Laura could do to help him, so he had to help himself. His punch was perfectly placed and whacked against the sow's head with a loud thud. The bear immediately released her grip on Andy's leg. She turned and gathered her cubs up. The three bears disappeared into the bushes, leaving Andy and Laura terrified and bleeding. After watching the bear leave, Laura ran to Andy's side to assess his injuries. She looked his right calf muscle over and could see that the majority of the muscle of his calf had been torn open and his leg was bent in places where it wasn't supposed to. She searched through his backpack, pulled out several socks, and improvised an inadequate but necessary tourniquet. Pictures of Andy's wounds would not pass YouTube guidelines, so I've uploaded them to my Patreon account. It is linked below for your review. Please look at these photos at your discretion, as they are fairly graphic. Once Laura wrapped the socks around Andy's wound, they discussed what action they needed to take next. She was too small to help him walk out, so that option was off the table. The next option they'd considered required Laura to hike up the mountain until she found cell service. Andy agreed to wait for her and speak to himself loudly to scare away any other animals that may approach him. Laura didn't want to leave Andy there by himself, but hiked away, knowing she had to get help for it. She immediately grabbed her cell phone and headed up the steep mountainside. As she climbed, she glanced around, still worried about running into the bears again. Storm clouds gathered on the mountains around her in an ominous sign. After an hour, she got service and phoned first responders, who sent out a medical helicopter to their location. As the helicopter approached, they found Laura and landed nearby. She pointed out to the crew where Andy was as they flew her back to safety. The crew returned without Laura to pick up Andy and take him to a hospital in Briaza. Upon arriving at the hospital there, the medical team recognized Andy's wounds were too serious for their facility. He was immediately flown to a hospital in Targumuras. Andy underwent surgery to clean and repair the damage done to his lower leg during the bear attack. His tibia and fibula had been broken in 3 locations and required the insertion of 3 screws attached to an external cage to hold his bones in place until they healed. After receiving treatment in the hospital in Targumuras, Andy was transported back to Berlin to finish healing from the bear attack. He was bedridden for many weeks before his leg was strong enough to start rehabilitation. His perseverance through a very long and painful rehabilitation routine eventually led him to make a full recovery from his injuries. Now only the huge scars are left to remind him. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think the bear spray may have prevented this attack? Do you think the bears returned to the fawn carcass after seeing Andy and Laura in the area? If Andy had dropped into the fetal position, would his mauling have been less severe? I will enjoy reading and replying to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.